My dad set fire to $38 million to prove I was nothing. But what he didn't know was I still had the real inheritance, and it wasn't something he could burn. The conference room smelled like lemon polish and old secrets. Cold air seeped through every crack in the sterile walls of Greavves and Halford LLP, the kind of place where legacy was measured in ink and paper, not love. Evan stood just inside the door, and no one looked up, not even a nod, not from the secretary who used to bring him candy as a boy, not from his sister, who sat legs crossed at the mahogany table like she already knew what victory tasted like. She smirked as if life had always bent in her favor. Maybe it had. His father, Leonard Greavves, sat at the head like a judge, not a parent. Navy tie knotted perfectly, spine rigid, hands clasped on the polished surface as if he were about to close another merger. Not a will reading, not today, not. Miss Halford, the family's lawyer for over 3 decades, cleared her throat and gestured for Evan to sit. Her voice trembled, but not from age. She knew what was coming. She read the will aloud like it was a confession etched in legal terms. Their grandfather, Howard Greavves, had died 3 weeks ago. A titan of industry, a man who had built his empire from a garage and left behind not just businesses, but ideas that still employed thousands. The room expected predictable divisions. Real estate to the daughter, stocks to the son, control split neatly down the bloodline. But the words that fell from Miss Halford's lips cut like thunder. To my grandson, Evan Greavves, the one who chose truth over approval, I leave the entirety of my estate, including financial assets, intellectual property, controlling shares in Greavves Interactive, and the collection housed in the Crescent Gallery vault. A silence fell like winter. Then the room exhaled, sharp, sudden, venomous. Leonard's chair creaked as he stood. His hands reached forward before Evan could even react. The oversized ceremonial check, meant only as a visual for legal records, was snatched from the table. Without a word, Leonard pulled out a gold lighter, and then he burned it. Right there, in front of them all, the numbers curled in flame, the ink melted down the page, and no one stopped him. The smell of smoke mixed with lemon polish, but Evan didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't raise his voice. He just smiled, because a month earlier, on a rainy Tuesday that no one remembered, Howard Greavves had slipped a letter into his grandson's coat pocket, a plain white envelope sealed with wax, and just 5 words written on it in trembling cursive, "Only open if they betray." Evan had carried it like a talisman ever since. Now, with ash floating through the air and betrayal made visible by firelight, it was time. He stood, nodded at Miss Halford, and walked out. He didn't say goodbye, because some stories don't end in courtrooms or inheritances. Some begin in silence and grow in the shadows where love once lived. Back in his car, parked blocks away to avoid attention, Evan pulled the envelope from his coat. He ran his thumb over the seal, cracked it. Inside was a folded letter and a USB drive taped to the paper. The letter was short. If they burn what's visible, give them what they fear. Truth. Use this only if they try to erase you. His grandfather hadn't left behind a check. He'd left a plan, and Evan intended to follow every line of it, because sometimes the ones they try to forget are the ones who rewrite everything. If this story held you even for a second, subscribe to Heart Story, where stories speak for those who've been silenced, and where truth always finds its voice. Stay for part 2, where erasure is not just emotional, it becomes legal. Back in his apartment, Evan plugged in the USB drive. The old silver casing clicked softly as the system recognized it. A folder appeared, labeled Greavves, Contingency. Inside were encrypted PDFs, legal documents, and a full digital archive of his grandfather's handwritten ledger pages, scanned and logged meticulously. He scrolled past banking credentials tied to an international account, original transfer deeds for the shares of Greavves Interactive, and most importantly, the legal transfer of intellectual property rights. Every piece of documentation proved what the will had already declared: Evan was the sole heir. But then something broke. As he tried to access the bank account, an alert flashed across the screen: access denied, account holder marked deceased. He blinked. A second window popped up: legal identity invalidated, documented mental instability, status deceased, cause unverified. Evan's chest tightened. The silence of the room felt louder now. He opened a search on the state registry. It loaded slowly, too slowly. But when it appeared, his name was there. Not under citizens, under deceased. A death certificate had been filed 2 weeks earlier. The certifying physician, a name he didn't recognize. The diagnosis, delusional disorder. The file included notes claiming he had been institutionalized, but Evan had never set foot in a psychiatric facility. Attached to the record was a letter signed by both Leonard Greavves and Clara Greavves, his sister. They'd declared him mentally unfit, accused him of fabricating claims of inheritance, and then submitted a private petition to have him legally removed from all ownership records of Greavves Interactive. They hadn't just tried to cut him out of the will, they had tried to erase him completely. Evan's next step wasn't to shout, it was to remember. He dug through an old email thread from years ago and found the contact Sylvia Lynn, a legal specialist in digital copyright theft. She had defended him once when another developer plagiarized his game mechanics at a conference in Boston. At the time, she said something that stuck with him. Your code has your name in its bones. Don't let anyone rewrite that. Now, she was the only person he trusted. Within hours, he was in her office glass walls, books stacked like armor behind her desk, and that same calm fire in her eyes. She listened without interruption, flipping through the documents he printed from the USB. When he finished, she looked up. The room quiet enough to hear the clock ticking behind her. They didn't just steal your money, she said. They lit a match to your existence. This isn't about inheritance anymore. This is about identity. Evan didn't speak. He didn't need to. Sylvia pulled out her laptop and began typing rapidly. Legal restoration, she explained. Wasn't just about proving he was alive, it meant reversing every fraudulent record, restoring authorship to his games, and bringing charges against those who had forged public records. But it would take time, and in the meantime, he would need to remain quiet. They think they've buried you, she said. Let them, we'll grow something under the soil. Evan nodded, eyes still scanning the documents on her desk. What his family had done wasn't just betrayal, it was strategy. They didn't confront him. They erased him, not through violence, but through paperwork, silence, and forged signatures. But what they didn't account for was memory, backups. The version of himself stored on drives, emails, and game builds that still bore his name in every line of code. In that moment, Evan realized something simple and brutal. People don't always try to destroy you with fire. Sometimes they do it with a form and a pen. They file it quietly while smiling at the neighbors. They write you out of existence and hope no one notices. But the truth? It doesn't need permission to survive. It just needs someone patient enough to uncover it. And Evan, despite everything, was still here. The building stood forgotten, wedged between a boarded-up deli and a shuttered photo lab. Its sign had long since faded. The letters, Greavves Printing, barely visible beneath grime and time. Evan hadn't been here since he was a child, when his grandfather used to let him sit behind the counter and scribble game ideas on receipt rolls. Now, guided by the instructions stored in that USB, he stepped through the rusted door into dust and silence. The interior was exactly as he remembered, except smaller. The counter still had the dent where he once dropped a whole cash register drawer. The shelves were bare, but he could still see the ghost of inventory. Paper stock labels curling at the corners. At the back, just behind the half-collapsed partition, was the safe. The key was taped beneath a drawer, just as the USB had said. It clicked open with a sound that echoed too loudly in the empty space. Inside wasn't money, no jewelry, no keys to a Swiss vault. Instead, there were blueprints. Dozens of them, folded and dated. The top sheet bore Evan's handwriting, childish but unmistakable, a sketch of a game studio, drawn in colored pencil, complete with a roof that looked like a spaceship and trees shaped like game controllers. His breath caught. Below that were architectural plans, real ones, refined and redrawn by a professional, annotated in his grandfather's handwriting. For Evan's studio, it read, "A place where no one gets pushed out." There were binders filled with concept notes, business plans for something called the Greavves Center for Creative Futures, described as a tech incubator designed specifically for LGBTQ plus youth who had been rejected by their families, a space to learn coding, storytelling, and game development, a place to build new worlds when the real one shut its doors. But that wasn't all. Tucked in the final folder was a legal envelope, sealed and notarized, with the original copy of the $38 million check. Uncashed, unburned, and protected under legal documentation that rendered it immune to symbolic destruction. Alongside it was a simple note: if they try to erase you, don't fight them at their level. Use what they can't control, your creativity. Evan sat on the cold floor for a long time. No anger, no tears, just quiet. He scanned and archived every document. Then he called Miles. Miles worked in digital forensics, an eccentric genius who once recovered an entire hard drive from a phone dropped in a lake. Evan trusted him not just with data, but with truth. Over the next few days, they combed through the files together. They uncovered digital inconsistencies in the forged contracts used to remove Evan's name from the company. Chopped signatures, timestamp mismatches, a web of lies built on careless digital footprints. But instead of heading straight to court, Evan chose something else. He opened his game engine and he started building. The game was simple in style, but brutal in story. A character is erased from his world by those he trusted most. He's told he never existed, his creation stolen, his voice silenced. But within the game, he begins to remember. He finds old blueprints, forgotten codes, fragments of a home once dreamed of. And he builds his identity again, line by line, world by world. There was no trailer, no marketing, just a quiet upload under a pseudonym. Within hours, forums exploded. Gamers began dissecting its hidden messages, pointing out metaphors buried in gameplay. Then someone found the code, a line deep in the engine, accessible only through a complex puzzle. When unlocked, it played a video grainy, time-stamped, and unmistakably real. Howard Greavves appeared on screen, seated at the very desk Evan had found the folders on. His voice cracked slightly but was firm. "Evan, if you're seeing this, they tried, didn't they? Let them. Don't waste time fighting back with their tools. Rewrite the story, build something they can't burn. And when they try to silence you again, remember, they don't own your voice. You do." By the end of the week, news outlets were picking up the story. Not the legal drama, not yet. But the question behind it: who is the real creator behind the game everyone's talking about? Evan didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because sometimes, the best response to being erased isn't revenge, it's legacy. And legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you choose to build, especially when no one thinks you're still here. The courtroom felt colder than the print shop. It wasn't the temperature, just the stillness. Marble floors reflected every movement like a spotlight. The walls carried a silence that didn't welcome emotion. But Evan walked in without hesitation, flanked by Sylvia and two interns balancing boxes of documentation that could fill a library. Opposite him sat Leonard and Clara, the father and sister who once filled his childhood photos. Clara kept her arms crossed, chin lifted, expression unreadable. Leonard wore a navy suit nearly identical to the one from the will reading, like nothing had changed. Maybe for them, nothing had. They still believed they held the narrative. But today, Evan came with the truth. Sylvia began the hearing by laying out the sequence of forgery, a falsified death certificate, complete with a fabricated medical diagnosis, a phony physician's signature, a petition to declare Evan mentally unfit and legally dead, forged transfer contracts redirecting shares of Greavves Interactive, metadata discrepancies in digital documents, screen captures, archived emails, video evidence, and the original check unburned, authenticated, and protected by Howard Greaves's final notarized directive. Every claim they'd made to ownership began to unravel, layer by layer. Evan didn't speak at first. He let the paper trail speak for him. The courtroom followed along paragraph after paragraph, signature after signature, until silence gave way to questions, then discomfort, then the weight of realization. When the judge finally asked Evan if he wished to address the court, he stood. His voice was even, not rehearsed, but steady. "They said I left the family, that I stopped communicating, that I abandoned them," he said. "But I didn't leave. I was pushed out." He paused. "Because I'm gay. Because I refused to lie. Because I didn't fit into the version of success they curated and performed for everyone else." No one interrupted. "They didn't just reject me. They tried to erase me on paper, in business, in memory. They called it protection. They called it business, but it was erasure, and they expected me to disappear quietly. The judge nodded slowly, but didn't speak. Sylvia took over again, submitting the final exhibit documentation restoring Evan's rights over Greavves Interactive, including intellectual property and legal identity. A motion was added to open a criminal investigation into the parties responsible for fraudulent filing of legal documents. Leonard, when questioned, claimed it was a misunderstanding, an attempt to prevent the company from falling apart under someone unstable. Clara echoed the sentiment, suggesting Evan had shown signs of emotional detachment, of delusion. They described him not as family, but as a liability. Evan didn't respond to their words. Instead, he handed the judge one final item, a framed screenshot of the code from his game, with his name embedded in the development log timestamped, published, and now recognized by thousands online as the work of its rightful creator. The courtroom quieted again. The ruling came swiftly. Evan Greavves was legally reinstated as the sole heir and rightful owner of the estate, company shares, and creative works. His identity, once declared null by a forged certificate, was restored. The court ordered an immediate audit into all documents submitted by the opposing party. The gavel fell like a bell. Afterward, as they exited the courtroom, the opposing counsel muttered loud enough for Evan to hear, "He doesn't deserve any of this. He's not the right kind of Greavves." Evan turned, calm. "I wasn't chosen," he said. "I was trusted." There was no satisfaction in watching them shrink, only clarity, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about the right to exist without permission, to take back space that was yours before others decided you no longer belonged. He didn't win because he shouted louder. He won because he refused to vanish. Sometimes, survival looks like quiet persistence. Sometimes, it's knowing when to speak. But more than anything, it's holding on to your name when everyone else tries to write it out. Evan never returned to the mansion where he'd grown up, not to collect belongings, not for closure. The home he'd been erased from had long since stopped being a place of safety. Instead, he walked back into the dusty remains of the print shop alone this time and flipped the faded close sign to open. The transformation wasn't instant. The walls were still cracked, the shelves still bare, but little by little, things changed. A new power line, a second-hand server rack, scrubbed floors, code scrawled on whiteboards, the creak of old furniture replaced by the hum of machines and the click of keyboards. What once was a forgotten storefront became the heart of a new world. Greavves Code Studio. There was no grand opening, no press conference, just a simple online post with one sentence. If you've ever been told you don't belong in tech or in your own family, this space is yours. And people came, teenagers with secondhand laptops, queer youth who had once hidden who they were in chat rooms, artists, gamers, dreamers. Some didn't know a line of code. Some had ideas scrawled in journals. What they all had in common was a story someone tried to delete. Evan didn't just teach programming. He taught ownership of stories, of creative voice, of space in a world that often tried to minimize it. There were no uniforms, no grades, only questions. What do you want to build and what will you leave behind? Then one morning, a boy arrived, 14, maybe 15, baggy hoodie, eyes that darted from corner to corner like he expected someone to tell him he didn't belong. He didn't speak at first, just hovered near the back wall, watching. At the end of the day, when the others filed out, he stepped forward and handed Evan a folded piece of paper, a letter. "I saw the game." It read, "The one about the boy they tried to erase. I played it 10 times. I didn't know people like me could survive. You were the first person I ever saw who did. I'm gay. I don't know anything about coding, but I don't want to disappear either. Can I stay?" His name was Nico. Evan nodded once and gave him a chair. He didn't need to say more. Later that night, Evan climbed a ladder and hung something above the main workspace, a framed piece of paper, wrinkled and faded. It was the original sketch he'd drawn as a child, the one his grandfather had kept all those years. At the bottom, in Howard's handwriting, was a single line, "Build, even if they try to erase." He looked around at the quiet hum of possibility, the once empty space now filled with potential, no longer just a tribute to what was lost. but a blueprint for what could never be stolen again, because they had burned a check. They had erased his name, but they couldn't touch what he built. And in the end, Evan didn't win through court orders or viral outrage. He won by becoming someone they couldn't control. By turning betrayal into design, by transforming pain into something tangible, playable, untouchable. Now, the world would remember his name, not because it was written in ink, but because it was coded into every line of hope he helped rebuild. So let's ask the question, if someone tried to erase you, would you fight to be remembered? Or would you build something so powerful they'd never forget again? Tell us in the comments, what would you create if no one could burn it? And if stories like this stay with you? Subscribe to Heart Story, where identity is never optional and legacy is always earned.